Good evening, good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming out on this bitterly, bitterly cold night. Really appreciate that. My name's Tom Hoon. I chair the BFA program in Visual and Critical Studies. And we're very happy to be hosting this evening a special visit by Leo Treitler, who's going to talk to us about mimesis, about imitation, something that a number of us here at SVA are very interested in. I'll tell you just a few brief things about Leo if you haven't read the poster. Leo was born in Dortmund, Germany in 1931. He emigrated to the US in April 1938. He studied composition with Boris Blocher at the Hochschule für Musik in Berlin in 1957 and 58. He received his BA and MA degrees in music from the University of Chicago, and then an MFA and PhD in music from Princeton. He also has an honorary doctorate of music from the New England Conservatory of Music. Leo has held professional positions at the University of Chicago, at Brandeis, at Stony Brook, at the Graduate Center of City University, where he is Distinguished Professor of Music Emeritus since 2003. He's also been a guest professor at Basel in Switzerland, at Berkeley, at Columbia, at Frankfurt, Germany, at Harvard, and Yale. Leo's been around. He is currently a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he's a fellow at the New York Institute for the Humanities. Some of his books include Music and the Historical Imagination, With Voice and Pen, Coming to Know Medieval Song and How It Was Made, Strunk's Source Readings of Music History, the revised edition. He's also written a book titled Reflections on Musical Meaning and Its Representations. I'm really most pleased to have Leo visit us to talk with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Leo Treitler.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come to this foreign territory. Little did I know when I chose the topic that I'm going to talk about that I could be addressing an audience of experts in the field, trained by my host, Tom Hoon, who himself is an author of distinguished work in the field, as I'm sure you know. And that was confirmed for me just this evening when I visited one of the bathrooms here. And somebody had painted on the trash basket, "Nothing is real." I could take that as a slogan for my talk. But in my efforts to make myself at home with the concept of mimesis, which have been recent and far less extensive than Tom's, I see it in two roles, not unrelated, as theory in the philosophy of aesthetics and as practical elucidative criticism in the arts, in history, in cultural, sociological, and political criticism. Remembering a lament I heard some 30 years ago in a lecture by the great philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, that die Philosophie ist so schwer, philosophy is so very difficult. I will mainly graze on the experience of my encounters with the idea of mimesis in this second role, mimesis at the level of the observer and at the level of the observed. My talk will be in 5 parts, and I suggest that we take a brief pause during the third part. Part 1, pictures. This cartoon appeared in the New Yorker magazine in 1955. Have a close look at it. The posture of the model, the gesture of the boys lining up their pens with their view of the model to get the proportions right, the few glimpses you get of drawings being made by some of the boys, enough to see that they are representing the model exactly as she stands? Or is it that she stands exactly as the boys have been taught to draw her? That is the wacky suggestion of the cartoon. The humor of cartoons is commonly achieved through such reversal of reality and representation. And if you've seen a lot of ancient Egyptian representations of the human figure, you will recognize the model's posture and the boy's drawings as stereotypical. Here's an example. Look at the posture of the male figure in the center, the side view, the angle of the arms, the position of the legs. If I had had more time, I would have found an example with the angle of the hands to the forearm exactly as they are in the cartoon. I found the cartoon not in the New Yorker, but as the frontispiece of E.H. Gombrich's great book, Art and Illusion, where its role is, in fact, to make just such a suggestion about the relationship between reality, life, and its visual representation. Gombrich asks provocatively, is it possible, as our cartoonist hints, that the Egyptians perceived nature in a different way? I'm going to show you now another, this time serious, representation of this theme in Gombrich's book. His offering of a drawing of a lion by the master builder Villard de Honnecourt, circa 1235, where the artist gives his assurance that it is drawn. His word is contrefait, sounds like counterfeit, from life. Gombrich comments, he can have meant only that he had drawn his schema in the presence of a real lion. I would add, one who had just been to the hairdresser's. How much of his visual observation, this is Gombrich again, how much of his visual observation he allowed to enter into the formula is a different matter. Saul Steinberg, New Yorker cover, March 29, 1976. This is a representation with layers of deliberate irony. Joel Smith, in his compilation Steinberg at the New Yorker, characterized it as Steinberg's, quotes, most widely known drawing, which has long been hard to see through its encrustation of fame, close quote. Its common interpretation as the New Yorker's view of the world overlooks the last part of its title, View of the World from 9th Avenue, one of the city's pockets of nowhere, nobody's symbol of anything. The worldview of what Steinberg called privately the crummy people. Smith reports, as imitations of the cover were churned out for chambers of commerce everywhere from Vienna to Peoria, all this was jettisoned. Steinberg's New Yorker cover, May 17, 1973. If the popular viewer's reception of View of the World from 9th Avenue overshadowed the artist's own intention, there's no mistaking what he foresaw in what he saw on the streets of New York and represented in the cover of this New Yorker. It is as plain as the nose on her face, so to speak. Vincent van Gogh, The Potato Eaters, 1885. More than what meets the eye, on the other hand, is represented in this painting, and we are guided to it and moved by it through the vision of the gifted seer and writer Meyer Shapiro. He writes, in a quote, Van Gogh found in their common meal the occasion in which their humanity and moral beauty are strikingly revealed. They appear then as a close community based on work, on the sharing of the fruits of work. The table is their altar, and the food a sacrament for each one who has labored. Under the single light at this common table, the solitude of the individual is overcome, and the harshness of nature too. Yet each figure retains a thought of its own, and two of them seem to be on the brink of an unspoken loneliness. In the homely faces and hand of these peasants, In color and modeling, they are like the potatoes that nourish them. There is a touching purity. It is the purity of familial souls in whom care for one another and the hard struggle with the earth and the weather leave little place for self-striving. The eyes of the two figures at the left shine with an inner light, and the shadows on their features are more a modeling of character than a phenomenon of darkness. Quoting Van Gogh, "I like so much better to paint the eyes of people than to paint cathedrals." There is representation on two levels here, those of the artist and of the interpreter. Neither is an imitator or copier. The vision of neither can be evaluated as to its accuracy. Van Gogh wrote, "Real artists paint things not as they are, but as they feel them." And "I adore Michelangelo's figures, though the legs are too long and the hips and backsides too large. What I want to do is to make these incorrections, deviations, remodelings, or adjustments of reality, something that may be untrue, but is at the same time more true than the literal truth." Stephen Halliwell is the author of The Aesthetics of Mimesis, Ancient Texts and Modern Problems, 2002. He's contributed a concise entry on this concept to Gale's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, from which I would like to quote here for its usefulness for the continuation. Mimesis has been a cardinal concept for those traditions of aesthetics from antiquity to the present that focus on the status and value of artistic representation. The semantics of the Greek term mimesis cover much more than simple imitation. In the book, Halliwell writes of the, quotes, "lamentably still standard translation of mimesis as imitation." Continuing in the encyclopedia, the Greek term's senses include resemblance, dramatic impersonation. Mimesis is thought to derive from mimos, actor, and other species of correspondence or likeness. Plato's highly influential approach to mimesis is less straightforward than is usually claimed. From Cratylus to Laws, he applies the language of mimesis to numerous relationships of ontological and/or semantic dependence. Mimetic entities match, but never reproduce their exemplars. In representational art, those exemplars may be imaginative. In distinguishing objective viewer-dependent mimesis, Plato does not ascribe a uniform rationale to all artistic representation, but he suggests that the impact of mimesis necessarily reflects the qualities of the supposed reality it projects. Still quoting from Halliwell, Aristotle in the Poetics explicitly accepts that the contents of mimetic art can legitimately vary between the actual, what is, the putative, what is said to be, and the ideal, what ought to be. Regarding mimesis as an instinctual factor in the human need to model and understand the world, he embeds it in an anthropology of cognition that stretches from child's play to philosophy. Ends quote. Halliwell sees implicit in this an opening to viewer-dependent mimesis, a notion to which Gombrich devoted the third part of Art and Illusion under the title The Beholder's Share. What is hinted at, but insufficiently explicit in Halliwell's encyclopedia entry, is the practice of mimesis as interpretation, such as we've already witnessed and will continue to see. Part 2, Stories. In 1966, there appeared in the journal Natural History an article Shakespeare in the Bush, an American anthropologist, set out to study the Tiv of West Africa and was taught the true story of Hamlet by the anthropologist Laura Bohannon. The author recounts an aspect of her experience during a residence with a tribe of some 140 people. Storytelling was a principal occupation during the days after the harvest, and the elder in charge urged her to join in and tell a story from her own people. She protested that she was not a storyteller and certainly not up to their skill in the art. When the old man promised that they would not criticize her, she assented, and one evening she set out to tell the story of Hamlet. She began, not yesterday, but long ago a thing occurred. One night, 3 men were keeping watch outside the homestead of the great chief when suddenly they saw the former chief approach them. Why was he no longer their chief? Asked one of the elders. He was dead, I explained. That is why they were troubled and afraid when they saw him. Impossible, interrupted a second. Of course it wasn't the dead chief. It was an omen sent by a witch. Go on. Slightly shaken, I continued. One of these 3 was a man who knew things, Horatio. So Horatio spoke to the dead chief, saying, tell us what we must do, so you may rest in your grave. But the dead chief did not answer. He vanished, and they could see him no more. Then Horatio said this event was an affair of the dead chief's son, Hamlet. There was a general shaking of heads around the circle. Had the dead chief no living brothers, or was this son the chief? No, I replied. That is, he had one living brother who became the chief when the elder brother died. The old man muttered, such omens were matters for chiefs and elders, not for youngsters. No good could come of going behind a chief's back. Clearly, Horatio was not a man who knew things. And so it went on, Bohannon struggling with her narrative, increasingly frantic as her listeners broke in freely, correcting her again and again in accordance with how they knew things should be. When she had concluded, the chief elder said, that was a very good story, and you told it with very few mistakes. Sometime, he concluded, you must tell us some more stories of your country. We, who are elders, will instruct you in their true meaning, so that when you return to your own land, your elders will see that you have not just been sitting in the bush, but among those who do know things and who have taught you wisdom. It was a sense of propriety or decorum, not of recognizable verisimilitude, that was for the Tiv elders the criterion of truth in the telling of history. Recall Aristotle's differentiation among the real, the putative, and the ideal as criteria of truth in mimesis. For the Tiv elders, it is the ideal. An essay, Mimesis in Greek Historical Theory, by the classicist Vivian Gray, reports on, quoting, the use of mimesis to describe what the historian does in creating his history. Her principal witness is the 1st century BCE rhetorician Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and the principal work of his that she cites is his critical essay on Thucydides, which focuses on Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, 431 BCE. For example, Dionysius writes in chapter 43 of the essay, quoting, the defense of Pericles in the 2nd book of the history, which he made on behalf of himself when the Athenians were exasperated because he persuaded them to undertake the war, I do not approve in its entirety. Thucydides has Pericles say, this outburst of your anger against me is just what I expected, for I see the reasons, and I have called this assembly for the express purposes of calling to your attention and remonstrating with you. If in any respect you are wrong, either in being angry with me or in giving way to your misfortunes. Dionysius comments, such language as this was suitable for Thucydides' writing about Pericles in the form of a narrative, but it was not appropriate for Pericles, who was defending himself against an angry crowd, especially so at the beginning of his defense, before he had tempered the anger of men with arguments of another nature. For orators ought not to stir up, but to calm the anger of the masses. This is a criticism like that of the Tiv elders as to the propriety or decorum of the telling, an ideal, not the accuracy of the report. After all, this is 4 centuries after the fact. 2 other citations in Gray's essay provide perspectives on the mimesis imitation conundrum. First, Dionysius wrote, "The good poet and orator must create a mimesis of the events he describes, not only in his choice of words, but in his arrangement of them." And he gave the following example. Homer's description of the labor of Sisyphus was a mimesis of events in that the long syllables predominating in his chosen vocabulary constitute a mimesis, Gray writes imitation, of the arduous effort Sisyphus had to make in rolling his stone uphill. Let's consider a musical parallel. Beethoven composed an overture for the performance of Goethe's play Egmont, which is about the Spanish colonial tyranny over the lowlands and the eventual defeat of the Spaniards under the leadership of the hero Egmont. The music begins with a single orchestral chord as announcement, then a series of chords played very slowly in deep, sinister instrumental register, and with this rhythm. This is the rhythm of a Spanish dance called saraband, which is usually played faster and hardly with such deep, dark coloration. Beethoven chose it and colored it in this way to evoke the play's oppressive atmosphere. Call it punning or metaphor or even methexis. I'll explain that in a bit. All 3 as representation or evocation, but imitation, if one thinks about it, would make a nonsense. Consider this an introduction to the concept of mimesis in and about music, to which I'll return later. You can sit, John. In the second of the citations in Gray's essay, the 1st century BC historian Diodorus of Sicily wrote about the fundamental obstacle to history writing considered as narrative. Narrative writing is linear and can only record one action at a time, whereas, I'm quoting, in life, many different actions are consummated at the same time. The written record falls far short of arranging them as they really were. Those 4 words evoke a phrase that has been called by the historian Leonard Krieger, quoting, the most famous statement in all historiography. I'll read the context in which they occur, translating from the original German. History has had assigned to it the task of judging the past, of instructing the present for the benefit of ages to come. The present study does not take on such high offices. It wants only to show how things really were. That is from the preface to History of the Romantic and Germanic peoples from 1494 to 1514, published in 1824. The author is Leopold von Ranke. The statement, and especially its last 4 words, earned the éclat with which they were aggrandized for their adoption by disciples as the model of a new tradition of history writing that was labeled positivist, just as their author became lionized with such epithets as the father of the objective writing of history and the founder of the science of history. 3 years before the publication of that book, the philosopher, linguist, educator, and diplomat Wilhelm von Humboldt delivered a lecture to the Royal Prussian Academy of Sciences on the task of the writer of history, which, he said, is the representation of the flow of events as they happened. Which he said, oh yes, this formulation has sometimes been credited with anticipating von Ranke's. That misses the profound differences between their conceptions, which turn on their views of the role of the historian and of the subject about which he or she writes. The key words are von Ranke's show as compared to von Humboldt's represent, and von Ranke's the past as compared to von Humboldt's the flow of events as they happened. The terms in each of the key pairs are matched. Von Ranke's historian stands aside and points to a fixed past. He wants only to show. His really is of a piece with that. Von Humboldt's historian gives a representation or enactment of an ongoing past's present. Attention to this difference is drawn by Stephen Bann in his book, The Clothing of Cleo, a study of the representation of history in 19th century Britain and France. This book published in 1984. Bann writes, von Humboldt's representation, the original German is Darstellung, try to remember that word, is thus a term whose shades of meaning adhere, for the most part, to a traditional mimetic formula. Ranke's statement presents the utopia of historical discourse in the 19th century, which is to lie entirely outside the province of poetry and style. For confirmation, he cites von Ranke's autobiography, in which Ranke relates how he, quoting, took the resolution to avoid in his works all imagination and all invention, and to restrict himself severely to the facts. In this light, Bann associates the slogan that 19th century historians adapted from Ranke's dictum with parallel 19th century practices, the true-to-life taxidermy that came to inhabit the displays of natural history museums, the imposition of an ideal of literal fidelity on translation, and photography, all representing what Bann calls a new heterodox, non-mimetic discourse that swelled by the 1820s and became a torrent by 1900. And he laments the extreme, perhaps excessive value which our culture still places upon the myth of recreating the real on the image of the historian. He might as well have said the poet, the painter, and as we shall see, the composer as taxidermist. That is, by way of simulation of the real. But this lament is hardly new. The epistemological issue between the historian of von Ranke and the historian of von Humboldt is enacted in Plato's dialogue, Cratylus, over the nature of the link between the things, events, and persons of the world and the names by which we identify them. Cratylus himself asserts that the appropriateness of names to the things that they refer to is, or should be, based on the likeness between them. Hermogenes insists, on the other hand, that names are conventional and are linked to meanings for those who are agreed about the linkages. Socrates seems to squirm through his moderation of the discussion because he recognizes the appeal of Cratylus's conviction, as we can tell from his granting, like it or not, that imitation is second nature to human beings. Aristotle took that up, putting it in the Poetics that imitation is natural for human beings from childhood. But then Socrates is forced to conclude on empirical grounds that, quoting, the correctness of a name turns out to be convention, since letters which are unlike their objects are indicative equally with those which are like, if they are sanctioned by custom and convention. And he concludes regretfully with an admission of his dilemma. I fear that this dragging in of resemblance, as Hermogenes says, is a kind of hunger which has to be supplemented by the mechanical aid of convention with a view to correctness. For I believe that if we could always, or almost always, use expressions which are similar to their objects, this would be a perfect use of language, end quote. He is caught up in the myth that Pan lamented and is troubled about that. The modern writer who has made the greatest contribution to the articulation of the mimesis concept for the criticism of the arts is Erich Auerbach, with his book Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Literature, first published in German in 1946, the year after the end of World War II, first published in English in 1953, with numerous subsequent editions in both languages. I want to comment on the English title, which misrepresents the book in important ways. But first, a little background about its history. Auerbach was a Jewish German born 1892. In 1929, he became a member of the philology faculty at Marburg University, and in 1935, he was dismissed from his post by the Nazi regime, the common fate of Jewish professors throughout Germany. But untypically, he emigrated to Istanbul, where he remained throughout the war, writing mimesis. He moved to the US in 1947 and died in 1957 as professor at Yale University. In an afterword to the book, he commented that he was limited in his work by the scarce source material about Western literature in Istanbul. But on the other hand, had he had a first-class library of Western literature at his disposal, he would have spent so much time reading that he might never have gotten down to writing the book. At the very end of the afterword, he wrote this: "With that, I have said everything that I believed I owe the reader. It remains only to find the reader. May my examination find its readers, as well my surviving friends of yore as others for whom it is intended, and may it contribute to bringing together again those who have preserved, without clouding it, our Occidental history." About the English title, particularly the subtitle, getting it right can contribute to understanding Auerbach's notion of mimesis and the nature and content of the book. What the German subtitle says is not the representation of reality in Western literature, but represented reality in Western literature. The representation of reality sounds like you're about to get a treatise on representation, but there's hardly any explicit theory in the book, which is instead a compendium of demonstrations of represented reality in randomly selected specimens of Western literature from antiquity to the 19th century. If I can remind you of the difference between von Ranke's and von Humboldt's ideas of history, it is von Humboldt's idea that is akin to Auerbach's sense of mimesis. That is evident from their joint use of a single key word in their original German descriptions of their respective enterprises, a word that is unfortunately not exactly translatable into English and is at the heart of the mimesis concept. The verb made noun in von Humboldt's description, the representation of events, is Darstellung. The verb in past tense in Auerbach's subtitle, represented reality, is dargestellt. Represent is the usual translation of the present tense verb form Darstellung, but it can also be portray, describe, give an account of, interpret, picture, render, enact, visualize, present, imitate, perform. The performing arts are darstellende Künste in German. Darstellung, recall, is the word that von Humboldt used to characterize what the historian does. As a lead-in to his survey, Auerbach makes a comparison of the modes of representation in two stories from antiquity. From the Odyssey, the narrative of the old housekeeper Euryclea's recognition of Odysseus upon his return home, and from the Old Testament, the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. In telling of the recognition scene, Homer relates that Penelope has granted hospitality to the disguised, exhausted Ulysses and instructed Euryclea to wash his feet. As she does so, the old woman recognizes a scar on his thigh. With that, Homer interrupts the narrative to dive back decades to the detailed description of how the youthful Ulysses came to have that scar. A visit to his grandfather, the welcoming banquet, the preparation for a hunting party the next morning, the boar hunt, the cornering of a boar, its attack on and wounding of Ulysses, the recovery and return home, the explaining of the episode to the worried parents. Auerbach singles out two features that are characteristic of Homer's way of shaping the reality of his story. First, every episode is self-sufficient, complete in itself. Every moment is an independent and exclusive present and commands complete attention. Second, every detail that is introduced is completely unfolded as to its nature and origin. Every phenomenon is externalized in terms perceptible by the senses. The biblical story opens, and it came to pass that God came to tempt Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. Auerbach refers to the so-called Elohist as the storyteller by way of lending a sense of intentionality about the way in which the story is presented, and to give Homer a counterpart for the comparison, although that name is only a conventional personification of the sources for this version of the story. Auerbach observes, we do not know where either speaker is, nor do we know what Abraham was doing when God called to him. They are not in the same place. Their voices come each from some unspecified place. Concluding from the comparison, Auerbach writes, the Homeric poems are comparatively simple in their relation to the real life which they describe. We live with them in the reality of their lives. Their real worlds, he puts the quotation marks around, real, into which we are lured, contains nothing but itself. The world of the scripture is not satisfied with claiming to be a historically true reality. It insists it is the only reality. Doctrine is incarnate in the stories and inseparable from them. The two styles in their opposition represent basic types. On the one hand, fully externalized description, uniform illumination, uninterrupted connection, all events in the foreground displaying unmistakable meanings. On the other hand, certain parts brought into high relief, others left obscure, abruptness, suggestive influence of the unexpressed, background quality, the need for interpretation, universal historical claims. In some, but not all respects, the two types resonate with the Thucydides, Dionysius, and the Shakespeare in the Bush stories, respectively. Part 3, music. This is complicated. Perhaps I feel it more that way because it's my métier. Recall my citing of the opening of Beethoven's Egmont Overture with a Spanish dance rhythm as an evocation of the atmosphere in the Netherlands under the Spanish tyranny. Other dance genres were well known at the time, all with different national characters: allemande, gigue, bourrée, gavotte. Imagine if these were used by composers as a kind of systematic vocabulary for musical representations of various characters. Something like that, but with a larger repertory of musical symbols, is what some music theorists of the 17th century proposed on the model of rhetorical figures in language and in view of the growing interest at the time in the affects. In fact, no such system was actually in practice. But some music scholars today still support their reading of music with reference to such a supposed system under the cover of hermeneutics or semiotics, primarily under the influence of T.W. Adorno's persistent and dogmatic exegesis of music since the Enlightenment in socio-political terms. For example, and I'm quoting Adorno, the musical dialectics which in sonata form that's a characteristic form of music in the classical era, mediate between harmony, the general, and thematism, the particular, as a reflection of the conflict between society as a whole and a particular interest. That is from his Klangfiguren of 1959. Or, here and now, quoting again from Adorno, here and now, music can do nothing but represent in its own structure the social antimonies which also bear the guilt of its isolation. It will be better the more deeply it can make its forms lend shape to the power of those contradictions and to the need to overcome them socially, the more purely the antimonies of its own formal language will express the calamities of the social condition and call for change in the cipher script of suffering. Its social function will be more exactly fulfilled if the social problems contained in the innermost cells of its technique are represented in its own material and according to its own formal laws. This he published in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, the Journal for Social Research, in 1932, and repeated it in the Introduction to the Sociology of Music, 1988. You see that such pronouncements are in his writings on music throughout his career. The approach would later inform one critic's contemporary exegesis of a movement of a piano concerto by Mozart in terms of the subjugation by the orchestra representing society of the piano representing the individual. This was proposed explicitly in response to Adorno's propedeutic for the interpretation of music. The reading occurs, that reading occurs in an essay entitled A Musical Dialectic from the Enlightenment. In another such reading, the march in the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is identified as a Turkish march, overriding Beethoven's own marking, alla marcia, and explaining it as Beethoven's representation of an, quotes, anti-European militancy in the midst of the symphony's overall, quotes, Philhellenist character. The specific historical references of these exegeses, Enlightenment, anti-European militancy, marks an added fad for historicism, in quotes. The second seems to attribute an extraordinary clairvoyance to Beethoven, that is to say, anti-European militancy. Such links between music and its references have been characterized by such expressions as facile metaphors by Charles Rosen, hidden gaps by Karl Dahlhaus until his death in 1989, Germany's most brilliant music scholar, and short circuits by Milan Kundera. It should be noted that these readings are imitative by pretension and unsupportably mimetic in fact. They exemplify the hunger for the dragging in of resemblance that Socrates lamented and the myth of the composer as taxidermist, as Ban might have put it. Musicology, the scholarly and scientific study of music, principally Western music, was formally initiated by German scholars in the second half of the 19th century, under the influence there of the neighbor discipline of art history. As such, its primary focus was on the history of musical style, with the emphasis on style development, and so it remained until at least the 1950s. About that time, there surfaced an impatience with the generalizing character of style history and a desire to focus more on the individual work. That encouraged a pursuit of musical meaning in the form of hermeneutic or semiotic exegesis, such as that I've just mentioned, which was trumpeted under the banner of a, quotes, new musicology, and for a mimetic criticism that I want to exemplify next. But before I do so, let's take a 5-minute break or so. What is it that music might represent in a mimetic sense? For the beginning of an answer, I turn to the oldest book on music that we know from Western musical history, from Western musical tradition. It is called Musica Inquiriadis, Handbook on Music, an anonymous compendium of musical knowledge written about 900 AD. There we can read, and I quote, "As in other things that we discern only partly and dimly, this discipline does not at all have a full, comprehensible explanation in this life. To be sure, we can judge whether the construction of a melody is proper and distinguish the qualities of tones and modes and the other things of this art. Likewise, we can adduce on the basis of numbers, musical intervals, or the sounding together of the pitches, and give some explanation of consonance and dissonance." This is a remarkable passage for the oldest piece of writing on music in our tradition, because you could write this, put this right in a catalog of for music departments, for their departments of music theory. That is what it's about. Anyway. But in what way music has so great an affinity and union with our souls, for we know we are bound to it by a certain likeness, we cannot easily express in words. How do we know that, by the way? Well, Boethius told him. This recognition at the very beginning that the ambition to arrive at a comprehensible explanation of music's affinity with the human soul is a matter of the use of language is striking. If we believe, as I do, that what music can represent comes down to human experience, feelings, impressions, desires, gestures, energies, postures, actions, moods, then a mimetic music criticism calls for an imaginative, creative use of language that can contravene the long and widely held belief that music is ineffable. And it also will demonstrate that the response to music is a response from human experience. I'm going to draw my examples from a recent book that displays a gift for such a use of language, Mozart's Grace by Scott Burnham, published by Princeton University Press 2013. This is a very thin book and one that I would very highly recommend to you. The opening of the Don Giovanni Overture, writes Burnham, is one of the great shockers of the Viennese classical era. It's not just arresting, but materializes with paralyzing immediacy like the head of Medusa. End quote. And that, in turn, is one of the great shockers of music criticism. It evokes the scene in which Perseus takes the terrible head out of his pouch, displaying it to the giant sea monster that is advancing upon the beautiful maiden, upon which the monster at a single glance is paralyzed and turned to stone. Let's have the next music. Continuing the citation, thus are we affected by the stentorian octaves of the brasses, the full chords of the winds, the strings syncopating against the bass's implacable half notes, the last of which sustains beyond the upper voices. The most frightening touch of all, to hear the brass emerge like this, is to feel the menace, to realize that the terrifying face is staring at you. Burnham declares at the start of this passage that the harmony textbook is no help here. What he means by that is that an appeal to the technical language of music theory, whose truth value is claimed to be readily assessed, won't do. That is, to that aspect of musical explanation that, that the Musica Incuriatus, that ancient treatise, said we could do. Those are things we can understand. He reaches instead, Burnham reaches instead for language that is as otherworldly as he wants us to sense the music to be, calling up an imagery as complex and ineffable as the music it means to characterize. What makes, quoting, what makes this entire passage unforgettable is those violin scales. As though in a stupor, the violinists seem to be reduced to moving their fingers unconsciously, as if capable only of marking the rising half steps, sounding around them on a kind of abacus of fear. Here again, we are faced with the hair-raising effect of liminal experience. I'll continue with more language from the book. No, we want the next musical example, sorry. Is it? There isn't another one. No, it's the same one. Sorry. I'll continue with more language from the book. Ideally, we would listen to the passages to which it refers, but then we'd be here all night. If you're musically literate, you can do that on your own. The music to which this language refers is all printed in the book, and you can find many performances of the overture online. Continuing, a shift into a different realm through the looking glass, leaping into some as yet uncharted inner space, continually sinking inward, a hushed, mystical interface with the divine, when the world has just been redrawn forever, hyper-reality, otherworldly calm, numinous, other-dimensional, hypnotic undulation. This precarious leap into the void, runic quality, Olympian indifference, supramundane, a timeless realm or a realm that is all time, floating within a new temporality, as if in a seance full of mystery. I'm reminded of a sentence in a story by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. On the veranda, a string quartet was playing Mozart, full of foreboding. Two observations. First, not one of these language expressions associates specifically in a natural or conventional way with music, whereas all of it refers to human experience or feelings or states of mind or actions. Second, not one of them is an expression whose truth value as characterizations of the music to which they are referred can be established, so that criteria of accuracy or truth cannot be applied in any objective way. To associate these expressions with passages from Mozart's music is to make bold leaps of meaning. I'll say semantic leaps, without meaning thereby to claim a semantic component from music. I borrow that expression from the title of a book from the discipline of linguistics, Semantic Leaps, Frame Shifting and Conceptual Blending in Meaning Construction, by Shauna Colson, Cambridge University Press, 2001. Here is a brief definition of semantic leaps from the author. Quotes, natural language constructions that yield non-obvious meanings, speakers or writers representing, organizing, and using their knowledge in the production and interpretation of language, producing non-standard meanings absent from dictionaries in metaphors, metonyms, hyperbole, understatements, similes, analogies, innuendo, private meaning. Close quotes. This idea of creative language is known from antiquity. Aristotle wrote about metaphor in the Rhetoric, quoting, when the poet, Homer I presume, calls old age stubble, he produces a new idea, new knowledge. Close quotes. Part 4, film. If mimesis is the artistic representation of reality, then Woody Allen's 1983 masterpiece, Zelig, may be the ultimate mimetic artwork. But that must be taken in both senses of ultimate, as the zenith and as the last. And if the survival of mimesis as a concept of art criticism depends on protecting it from contamination by the concept of imitation, efforts of which we've seen, then the film subverts such efforts. It is an amalgam of the two. And if the concept of imitation from its Latin root imitatio to its place in modern languages includes in its semantic field the idea of fake or faux, that is what the film is about. In its external form as black and white documentary, newsreel, in the sudden technicolor pretend reality of the talking heads, Susan Sontag, Irving Howe, Saul Bellow, and Bruno Bettelheim, all doing their best to look guru-esque. The resurrection of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who first discovered Zelig in the mix of real and simulated outtakes from 20s films, and the scratches and crinkles imposed on the negative to make it look old, and in every thread of the storyline. In the story, the nebbish character whom Allen so often portrays in his films, desperate to be liked, accepted, to fit in, to be like people around him, is transformed into a human chameleon who can make himself like them, physically, in speech, in behavior. He is a shapeshifter, and the film, among its other identities, takes its place among the worldwide legends and myths about Proteus-like figures. But there is a compulsion about imitation. It boils over in the plot line itself. Zelig, marked as mentally disturbed, Zelig, marked as mentally disturbed, is submitted to psychoanalysis, which he resists by posturing as a psychiatrist and addressing the psychiatrist as a patient. She, in turn, decides to imitate him, telling him she's not a psychiatrist and needs him to minister to her in his role of psychiatrist. This overwhelms him, and he falls apart. The reality that is represented and parodied by the film, the vraie vérité outside of it, is the condition of a culture in which the boundaries between reality and virtual reality, between representation and imitation, and between original and copy are all unstable, and with them each of those concepts itself, and in which, because everyone can be a Proteus and a shapeshifter under the praxis of branding, personal identity is also unstable. Part 5, commercial, social, and political domains. I'm going to make an odd leap now of my own, from Zelig to Gregorian chant. About 20 years ago, I was drawn into an exercise in forensic musicology that can serve as a parable for my subject. It has to do with the re-release then of an album of recordings of Gregorian chants performed by the monastic choir of the Benedictine Abbey of Santo Domingo de Silos in Burgos, Spain, that practically overnight became a spectacular commercial success. It rose to second place on the Billboard 200 music chart, just below a recording of Michael Jackson's. It was, perhaps you remember this, I was recently contacted by the BBC to participate in marking of the anniversary of this event. It was originally recorded in the 1970s and distributed locally until it was purchased and strongly marketed by EMI Music International as an antidote to the stresses of modern life. 2 million copies were sold in the United States, 6 million worldwide. People who had paid no attention to Gregorian chant before were suddenly finding its music perfectly adapted not only to devotional practice and aesthetic pleasure, but also to meditation, sleep inducement, and lovemaking. As the royalties piled up, a lawsuit was entered in Spain against EMI by 2 former monks of the abbey who had prepared and directed the original performances, which they now claimed as their intellectual property. As the repackaged recordings in the 1993 set were copies of their originals, they claimed, they were entitled to a share of the royalties. In what was one of the strangest partnerships that has ever been joined in the history of intellectual property litigation, the defendants, EMI, were joined in partnership by the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Pierre de Solesmes in France. Since the late 19th century, this abbey, under the imprimatur of the Catholic Church, has been in charge of the restoration of the medieval tradition of Gregorian chant and of the research and publication associated with that project, including the formulation of principles of performance that were concretized in widely disseminated recordings of performances by their choir. It was their counterclaim in the suit that the performances by the Silos choir follow exactly the style of those of the Solem choir. And in this claim, they were joined by EMI. And as this has been officially established as the restoration of the original medieval Gregorian chant tradition, the Silos recordings are copies and could not be claimed as intellectual property. They claimed further that the rules governing the Solem performances, which are laid out in the preface of their chant edition, Liber Usualis, carry the ultimate authority of divine inspiration. Reading from the preface, quoting, "The above rules have been drawn from the Holy Fathers, some of whom learnt this way of singing from the angels, while others received it from the teaching of the Holy Spirit speaking to their hearts in contemplation." I was engaged as a, quotes, expert witness to comment on these claims and counterclaims. When a few years later I encountered Dom Daniel Saulnier, then the director of research at Solem, I asked him about the outcome of the case, and he said proudly and with a big smile, "We won." It's hard to imagine that his jubilation was over the fact that EMI did not have to surrender any of its earnings to the plaintiffs. What did he win? The Spanish court's imprimatur on the Solem tradition of Gregorian chant performances as a brand, affirming the authenticity of the Holy Spirit's transmission and overruling what would have been Plato's insistence that these monks could render only flawed imitations of the idea of Gregorian chant. The American Marketing Association defines a brand as a name, term, sign, symbol, or design, or a combination of such intended to identify the goods and services of one seller or group of sellers and to differentiate them from those of other sellers. The extension of the concept has since spread from the token to the goods and the services themselves, and then to the person or persons offering them, and ultimately to the individuals themselves, whether or not they are selling anything. Branding has come to mean the creation of a unique identifiable persona image, business and or personal, for the marketing of the individual in either or both personas, the individual as brand. I was first made aware of this phenomenon in the early 90s while visiting Stockholm's elegant NK department store, which I had known from earlier years. A radical change had taken place in the taxonomy of clothes that were on sale and in the consequent organization of the store by departments. In place of the conventional departments, women's, men's, within each of those, dress, sports, and so on, there were now boutiques identified by styles. For example, a Marlboro boutique, where clothes for all genders were displayed, dominated by corduroy, denim, and leather in colors of beige and smoky blue, evocative of cigarette smoke. The style signification of the clothing was amplified by the decor of the boutique: rope, unfinished wood, saddles not for sale, and on the wall, panoramic photographs of horses on vast plains with majestic mountain backdrops. Another boutique in the store was identified as Compagnie Générale Aéropostale, a virtual stage set with photographs of begoggled aviators in leather caps and jodhpurs carrying mail pouches onto their biplanes, and a Pepsi-Cola sign bearing the price tag 5 cents as a clue to the time period of the image. In each case, it is a brand in which all the items on sale in the boutique participate, a relationship that is well characterized by the Platonic concept of methexis, participation. Aristotle in the Metaphysics had it that the Pythagoreans named mimesis what Plato named methexis. The boutique manifests a signifying practice that defines a virtual reality in which the identity formation passes from sellers to consumers. The range of such virtual realities makes available a protean existence for a consumer complement of Zeligs. From the internet, I read you texts aimed at capturing in words the ineffable character of the brand of one commercial enterprise, meant to galvanize the resonance of consumer self-identification. From a shopper's guide, quoting, "Classic tan on dark brown canvas dominates the line, as does the familiar LV logo stamp, an instant status symbol, on luxurious purses of all sizes, suitcases, wallets, keychains, and sunglasses." A website offering secondhand goods identifies itself as Fashion File, America's most trusted source for pre-owned authentic luxury handbags, a Louis Vuitton vintage luggage tag, price $105. The contemporary multicolored monogram attracts a younger generation of loyalists. Think Jennifer Lopez and Paris Hilton. Leather and canvas travel gear, including vintage steamer trunks, suited for refined travel, the kind where a limo driver carries the bags. The commercial enterprise that is described in the shopper's guide is the Louis Vuitton store on Fifth Avenue in New York. Another internet firm with the address basicreplicas.com advertises Louis Vuitton replica handbags, authentically original imitations of the real originals. This zany vocabulary confirms the instability of the concepts original, imitation, authentic, real, and the boundaries or connections between them. My friend Jeffrey Hoffeld sent me this news item. In 2008, a Danish artist created an image showing an emaciated black boy with a chihuahua on one arm and a Louis Vuitton bag on the other. She called it Darfurnica, rhymes with Guernica, explaining it was meant to show that our celebrity-obsessed media were failing to address crisis situations such as Darfur. The Louis Vuitton firm sued her in a Dutch court, she lives in the Netherlands, claiming copyright infringement. The court held that it is perhaps inevitable that branded goods which, through the brand owner's relentless marketing efforts, acquire symbolic value, will be used by artists for their symbolic value. It ruled against the firm and ordered them to pay the artist's costs, assessed at 15,000 euros. Here, in a recent New Yorker ad, is the representation of a more neighborly confrontation between art and fashion. Right at home, in perfect comfort with this pictorial catalog of the Fifth Avenue Louis Vuitton Emporium, is one of our most ubiquitous art brands, Cindy Sherman. Can you read the legend? 6 iconoclasts, 1 icon. Christian Louboutin, Cindy Sherman, Frank Gehry, Karl Lagerfeld, Mark Newton, and Ray Kawakubo take inspiration from the iconic Louis Vuitton monogram. The claim seems questionable in all respects, most of all when you consider that in the background is a lawsuit by Louboutin, designer of women's shoes with red soles, against Louis Vuitton for copying his trademark red soles. As of 2009, there were 43 pizzerias in New York City with the name Ray's Original Pizza. This is not like Domino pizzas. The individual pizzerias do not have franchises with a central company. The word original is used in a semantically empty sense. In an illocutionary sense, it signifies copy, but not copy of any original. A film, Original, was made about this phenomenon around 2000. The guarantee of trust that is given by the company that offered the luggage tag at $105 has as its background the possibility of deception that worried Plato. Of the 153 museums in Paris, one is a kind of monument to the deception that arose from the knockoff tradition. La Musée de Contrefaction, the Museum of Counterfeits. It isn't intended as a monument, but as an alert to the public about the fakes that are foisted upon us. It was established for this purpose in 1955 by the Union des Fabricants, the Union of Manufacturers. Some 350 items are displayed in pairs, always one vrai and one faux. The range of items is very broad, well beyond the expensive luxury items that one assumes would motivate the industry. Swiss Army knives, children's toys, over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, household tools, cleaning fluids like Mr. Clean. Whether or not we believe in Plato's worldview, we have allowed a corresponding world to develop around us, and through our addiction to imitation, adapted to a life in virtual reality. It hardly matters to us any longer that we can't distinguish the vrai from the faux among handbags and pizzerias, but we in the US have tolerated the refusal of our government to distinguish between the vrai and the faux in international policy by way of evading our laws on the subject. A law enacted in 1973 by the American Congress requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action and forbids armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days, with a further 30-day withdrawal period without an authorization of the use of military force or a declaration of war by the Congress. This is usually known as the War Powers Act. It is consistent with the US Constitution, under which only the Congress has the authority to declare war and to provide funding of the cost of war. It was passed in reaction to the Vietnam War and has been ignored or resisted by nearly every president since. On June 3rd, 2011, the US House of Representatives approved a resolution calling on President Obama to give a justification for US military actions in Libya in accordance with the War Powers Act. The President responded in a letter to the Congress that since the US military role in Libya is subordinate to NATO's command, the US action does not qualify as a war. We have been there before. On January 11th, 1911, the English newspaper The Guardian published an article, The Reality Gulf, by the French sociologist philosopher Jean Baudrillard, author of the book Simulations, 1983. In it, he wrote, "The Gulf War will not happen." Governments had invented replacements for the reality of war: Cold War, deterrence, ultimatums, contraceptives against the act of war. First safe sex, then safe war. On February 27, the first President Bush announced the suspension of combat operations, not the end of war. And on March 29, Baudrillard published in the French journal Libération an article with the title, "The War of the Gulf Has Not Taken Place." Consigning the war's ravages to another level, he wrote, "The true belligerents are those who thrive on the ideology of this war. Through faking, through hyperreality, the simulacrum, through all those strategies of psychological deterrence that make play with facts and images, with the precession of the virtual over the real, to reestablish some criterion of truth, we lack the means. But at least we can plunge all that information on the war back into the element of virtuality from which they took rise." It looks as though we're about to be there again. On January 28th of this year, the White House signaled that the President plans to send draft language for a new war authorization in response to the latest barbarians of ISIS. I close by citing someone whom it has never before occurred to me to cite sympathetically, David Brooks, from his column in the New York Times, February 6th. This was called to my attention by Mary Frank. Quoting, "The best way to respond is to step out of their game." I read that as to abjure copying their game. It is to assert the primacy of our game. I read that as our original game. It's to reassert the primacy of pluralism, freedom, and democracy. It's to tamp down zeal and cultivate self-doubt. Close quotes. Thank you.
Well, thank you for opening the historiographic analysis of mimesis to show how open it can be. But the problem we enter into in criticism is when you move criticism into the synchronic space, as the horror withers. Where are the markers? What markers do we have, if any? In other words, by citing David Brooks seems to me to be citing, just establishing two sides of the same coin. We can go either way here. So between propaganda and where's the edge here? How do we sort this out, or do we?
Well, it depends on who you listen to. I've been listening to NPR a lot lately, and all I can say is that there are people on both sides of this, and there would be, I think, critics in both parties and among Washington think tank people of another kind of war resolution. Despite all the horrible images that that are shown on our TV screens, so I don't know. Actually, I think the only thing to say is that we have to worry a lot. But I think, I mean, my objective in this paper has been to try to show that we have been mesmerized into belief or acceptance of operating in virtual realities.
I wanted to add something, if I may, which is one of the most powerful insights for me in the talk was when you talked about liminal experience, right? Experience which is on the verge of we're not quite sure what's happening. And that gave me the idea that we might think about mimesis and representation as becoming problematic only when we want to do something with experience. If we just allow the flow of events, the von Humboldt, and so we just allow the flow of events and don't worry about representing it or reproducing it, then we don't get in much trouble. And we don't worry about how much real is here in the liminal and so on. But of course, living together in a political environment, what has happened in the flow of events demands in some way that we name it. That's a form, of course, of representing it. So the question of mimesis is not, of course, you realize this by ending on the political. The question of mimesis is not merely a question in aesthetics and how do we make reproductions and representations, but it's a question right at the heart of how do we, back to Auerbach, how do we represent, how do we make sense of what has happened for the sake of what is the next thing we want to do. And so I'm, again, emboldened to have the thought that the questions about mimesis are really at the heart of what we do in our experience and what we want to make of our experience.
Thank you. I think that's really, that's a very important observation. And what I'm getting from this remark of yours is that that this makes a kind of link between the aesthetic and the political.
Yes, and we're not the first people to notice
No,
this.
of course not.
This happens early on in the history of fascism.
Yeah, that's right.
And if we know this, aren't we advocating making these judgments? In other words, if this is going to happen, name, then do we simply throw it into the open marketplace, as it were?
I don't think it's a question of abdicating anything. I think it's more on the other side of realizing how much is at stake whenever we name what has just happened. Whenever we claim it is a copy of the real, or it is the real, or something on this vast continuum in which we try to represent what the hell just happened.
How are you able to decide anything, make any action, if the language you're being given is completely false, lying? They can't even use the word dead. What is it called? Collateral or something? I mean, there are very few words in the sort of common language about what's going on that are absolutely direct.
Well, that's right. There's, of course, a famous now ongoing debate about what kind of language Obama uses to represent who? Terrorists? Muslim terrorists?
Extremists.
No.
Yes. Well, this is a very sobering discussion. Thank you very much, Leo, for helping us so much with better understanding this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.